Chair thanks the gentleman. Chair recognizes the gentleman from New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I just want to first thank the witnesses for being here today, and I can't agree with the gentleman from Texas anymore with his sentiment. And thank you, Representative Griffith, for bringing this legislation forward. Can you please elaborate on how H.R. 467 addresses the issue raised by our colleagues on the other side of the aisle, who believe that this legislation would prohibit access to fentanyl for medical purposes or prohibit research?
Yeah, they're mistaken about that. It does not affect fentanyl itself, only the analogs, and what the doctors are using is fentanyl for medical purposes at this time. They're not using the analogs. The only people that ever came up with the analogs were the bad guys trying to get around the criminal penalties for bringing fentanyl into this country or for distributing fentanyl on the streets of our cities and our towns, our villages, and our rural counties. So that is not accurate. What was the second part? I know there was a second part. I forgot it.
For research purposes.
Oh, and look, one of the things I've always advocated is that we do more research on substances. I mean, we got into a real problem with marijuana where the universities couldn't research it, and so we don't really know. We've got all these states that have now made it legal for recreational purposes, and we don't know what the long-term effects are of heavy use of marijuana on somebody's physical health or their mental health. So one of the things I've always advocated is that we have a research component, which is why it's in this bill, is that we can research those analogs. If there are scientists or doctors or folks who feel that there's something an analog might be able to do that's helpful from a medicinal standpoint, our universities are authorized to be able to do the research, obviously being registered with the appropriate authorities.
And during the temporary scheduling, did the pharmaceutical industry or researchers or any other relevant entities express concern that the scheduling prevented the development of new medicines?
I haven't heard of any specifically. I know that NIH and some of our other institutions have done some research, but I haven't heard anybody, and there may be somebody out there, but nobody has said to me, we haven't been able to do the research that we wanted to do during the temporary. But if they do want to do it, we're making that available.
Yeah. Thank you. What impact has the emergency scheduling of fentanyl-related substances and the bipartisan extension of the scheduling that was included in last year's funding package, what has that had on the availability of these substances, particularly from China?
Well, it's completely shut down the analogs. I mean, that is not a concern at this point as far as smuggling it in, because the penalties are still there for fentanyl, but there's no advantage. The reason that they were coming up with the analogs is that there was an advantage. You could go into court and argue that it wasn't illegal. And the two, and I can't speak for the Democrat lawyers, but the two Republican lawyers have been very adamant, myself and Kelly Armstrong on the Energy and Commerce Committee, that if we don't do this permanently, what we're doing is we're setting up a situation where somebody happens to fall in between the cracks of the times that we have the temporary ban in place. They can argue that what they were selling was not illegal. That made a profit motive for both the Chinese and the Mexican cartels. The Chinese making either the API, the active pharmaceutical ingredient, or making the pill itself, or the cartels for transporting it. It's a benefit for them if we don't have the analogs scheduled as Schedule 1, and that's where the reason they were coming up with these different analogs, was to avoid the American criminal penalties.
Very good. Now, I've heard, and I know Mr. Roy touched on this for a moment, but I've heard our colleagues across the aisle in this hearing suggest that this legislation is just a continuation of the status quo. I mean, just for a final point of clarification, is this a status quo bill?
No, it's not. It does two things. One, it makes it permanent. Instead of every 2 to 3 years having to come into Congress and pass a new bill, which we've done since 2018. We've come in every so often and passed a new bill making the analogs illegal, because we recognize that that's a serious problem. And none of those bills that extended it dealt with minimum mandatories, by the way. But we've extended it till 2024. So in that sense, you could say between now and the end of December 2024, it doesn't change that part. But the whole thing about the research and allowing research, if there is a medical reason for using an analog, our NIH and other researchers may be able to find it. I don't know that they will. I'm skeptical that they will, but it gives them that opportunity instead of saying you can't look at it. And right now, other than the government agencies, I don't think any of our universities can do any research on the Schedule I substances. In fact, I'm pretty sure of that. Anybody, am I right on that team? All right. I think I'm pretty sure I'm right on that. But they can't do it on Schedule I substances. This would allow them to do research on Schedule I substances for purposes of determining if there is any medical purpose or use to an analog. Again, I'm not sure that that's true, but this is a huge step forward. If there is something, and what we really want to look for is an analog that acts as a blocker to the impacts.
Very, very helpful. Thank you, Representative Griffith. I appreciate you sharing and reiterating this point for the committee, particularly to my colleagues across the aisle who seem to forget that there was and continues to be a tremendous amount of bipartisan support for this straightforward and life-saving measure. And without Congress acting now, we will continue to face the same very real possibilities that the emergency scheduling begun by the DEA in 2018, a measure that has shown great results, will expire. Just last week, in this committee, we worked to report several bills in support of our local, state, and federal law enforcement officers. These men and these women who are working to keep our communities safe, and they're doing so while Democrat-run cities and states continue to defund them, malign them, and villainize them. I see this legislation before us today as an extension of the work that this majority is doing to support our law enforcement officers and our first responders. And people, like you talked about in your district, Representative Griffith, in my rural district, we have this same scourge, and I know every community in America is dealing with this scourge. And as law enforcement has noted time and again in their support of maintaining the scheduling, any expiration of that temporary scheduling would have led to a surge of new lethal fentanyl-related substances like nothing we've seen before. This legislation is clearly about maintaining policies that have brought results amidst a deadly epidemic that is ripping through our communities. I appreciate the work that has gone into this important legislation, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair thanks the gentleman, and Chair wants to thank this panel of witnesses for